And welcome back to the Durban Harbour. And as you can see, minus that big vessel that was behind me during our first crossing just after 6 this morning, and as massive as it is, it took all of about 10 minutes to get it out of port here. And we are seeing now the tugboats that had to escort it out of harbour returning. And we're here, of course, to talk about the dialogues that have been initiated by the Minister of Transport, Dr. Bladen Zimande, around the maritime industry and some of the opportunities that exist in this industry. South Africa, of course, a coastal state. We are surrounded by 3 oceans, but there is, of course, the concern that we are not optimizing this benefit to its greatest extent. So we'll be talking more about some of the opportunities, some of the threats, and of course safety in this particular industry as well. And joining me right now is Mr. Sobantu Tilayi, who is the acting Chief Executive Officer of SAMSA, which is the South African Maritime Safety Authority. And thanks so much for coming to speak to us this morning.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to your viewers as well.
Mr. Tilayi, let's start by getting an overview of the maritime sector and what exactly it encompasses and entails here in South Africa.
Well, the maritime sector holds a whole lot of potential. The opportunity to contribute to the country's economy in general. You'd recall that we had Operation Phakisa, and that had segmented the sector into 4 subsectors: the marine manufacturing, oil and gas, fishing and aquaculture. We added another one, marine tourism. Now the issue is how do you then account for the contribution of this sector into the economy of the country? Now we created a few sets of indicators. We said by the number of jobs that you've created. Operation Phakisa itself has a stated objective of creating over 177 billion rand per year from 2030 and building up to that. Of course, we've got an aspiration of creating 1 million jobs by 2030. And how are you going to do that? You obviously are going to get a sector that becomes quite vibrant, that has a whole lot of enterprises coming in, that has a whole lot of training, producing the skills and all such things. So ours is to grapple as to how do you get to that point. And while at it, there is an important issue of sustainable use of the oceans. We talk about climate change, we talk about pollution prevention. And so we're trying to weave all of these elements together to produce one very big vision for the country, that of moving the country in a sustainable way. And then the Minister of Transport has obviously started these dialogues, and the whole roadmap is guided by a comprehensive maritime transport policy. And I think today is a starting point to that dialogue to say, how shall we know that we've done it? What shall we be measuring? I suggest that the contribution to GDP, the number of jobs, as I've already spoken about. But here is the big overview of the country in general. And that is the dialogue that you must have. What do we need to do to get there?
So we often hear about Operation Phakisa and, fitting into that particular scenario. What does the maritime sector have to offer?
Well, as I was saying to you, you've got all these subsectors that we have. If you take, for instance, one objective for Operation Phakisa, it is to grow the National Ship Registry. Now, the reason you would want to grow the National Ship Registry is that this country has 300 million tons of trade, whether export or import, and that trade must be carried by ships. In 2014, 2015, we had 13,000 ship calls into all the South African ports. But if you look at the South African participation in that value chain, it's quite minimal. We've come up to about 4 ships that are registered on the flag, where you've got 13,000 ship calls. Now you can see the gap. Now every ship on average employs about 18 employees. And with all the rotation, you need double that number. But even more importantly, it is what you are able to get. And ships need a whole lot of shoreside support. Marine superintendents and every other skill that you require on the land side. And that is the beginning of an industry, because once you've got a ship, then you need insurance, then you need to fund it. So that is just the one stated objective under the ship registry. If you go to marine manufacturing, we've just completed a tug building program for Transnet that spent 1.3 that gave rise to 1.3 billion rand being spent here. And we've started a program, we call it the Rural Maritime the Rural Maritime Economy Development. And it encompassing how do you deal with issues of fishing, the small-scale fishers, those rural communities out there. How do you draw them towards the whole maritime sector, and what is their contribution? So this dialogue then is to help us refine our view on all those areas that we need to work on. What are the gaps that remain, and what do we do about those gaps? It is, we've got a stated view. We're starting the medium-term strategic framework that says, what shall we have by 2025? Well, you need a government that has got a complete policy. We've got a comprehensive maritime transport policy today, but you need a supporting mineral resources policy that says you've got 160 million tons of cargo, and that cargo needs to go to market. And how does South Africa benefit from that? You need a dialogue with energy, you need a dialogue with all the cargo owners, you need a dialogue with Treasury, because what drives shipping is taxation. So that whole dialogue needs to be arrived at by 2025, and that is our starting point. And while at it, we're looking at all those indicators that you need to continuously measure.
And just a final one in 15 seconds, you know, when we talk about safety in the maritime industry, we know of further on the East Coast, around the Horn of Africa, there are issues of piracy, etc. What are some of the major challenges that we face from a safety perspective with regard to the maritime industry?
We've got a very rough coastline with freak waves off the wild coast. Well, they call it the white coast for that reason. And we've seen a whole lot of ship casualties. Now, the difficulty you have is that you are a country that's at the bottom end and very far from any other concentration of activity. So our biggest issue is, what capacity do we need to be able to intervene in cases where ships get into trouble, whether running aground or sinking. So the whole capacity for the country to respond to marine casualties, which invariably lead to pollution. And those are the issues that we are going to be grappling with. How do you fund those things? It's expensive. A ship running aground costs about 2 million rand a day. Where do you get that money as government? They're supposed to be insured, but sometimes they are not insured. And what do we do in those instances? And that is the dialogue today.
Well, as you heard there, some of the issues to be discussed at that dialogue. Transformation is high up on the agenda. Business, government, labor, and they're all going to come together to try and find solutions here. And as we conclude this particular crossing, one of the tugboats just coming back there into shot, as I said, that vessel that was moved out earlier. So we're going to leave it there for the time being. When we come back to Durban, we will of course be speaking to Minister of Transport, Dr. Bonginkosi Nzimande. But for now, it's back to the studio and Valen with the latest sport.